This is the Wartime Broadcasting Service. This country has been attacked with nuclear weapons. Communications have been severely disrupted, and the number of casualties and the extent of the damage are not yet known. We shall bring you further information as soon as possible. Meanwhile, stay tuned to this wavelength, stay calm, and stay in your own house. Remember, there's nothing to be gained by trying to get away.
In January 2023, the Doomsday Clock was set by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists at 1 minute 30 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been to this so-called midnight, which in reality signifies how close we are to meeting our demise as a race, mainly due to a man-made nuclear catastrophe. Not to be all doom and gloom here, but this positioning of the clock could well change to be even closer in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the thinly veiled threats to the Western powers made by Putin and his subordinates. We're in a period of heightened tensions and Cold War style discussion of provocation and escalation, but thankfully, or maybe not, there seems to be a lack of fear or urgency amongst the general population, something that was certainly more prevalent during the second half of the 20th century with the Cold War. These weapons have been around for so long now that the question springs to mind for the younger generations. To quote Dan Carlin, if you're born with a gun pointed towards your head, do you even notice it? It's with this issue in mind that we today explore the chances of survival for an everyday citizen in the United Kingdom. Some of the information in this episode will be useful for other European countries, maybe even the US, but I'll likely go into specific detail on those places in a future edition. Now, if you've played the Fallout game series or have knowledge of the Cold War, you'll be familiar with the concept of vaults, aka bunkers that have the necessary provisions and systems in place to allow members of the public to survive in the event of an attack. It sounds like a good idea, and due to the sheer cost and space required for these shelters, you'd like to think the government would have taken charge of construction on behalf of its population. Let's look how this has been done in other countries. So in Switzerland, they have over 300,000 private and public shelters, something they're very proud of. And that's enough for the entire population. Now, this is probably the most developed country in the world in terms of its shelter policies and laws. Now, moving up to Finland, and they've got enough for 3 million of their citizens, with Helsinki having a bunker and tunnel network built into the bedrock. The neighbour Sweden has approximately 65,000 bunkers to fit 7 million people, to protect against all weapons that could be used, according to the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. And if we go a bit further east to Norway, they've got bomb shelters for around half of the population. However, if you look at articles and pictures online, it seems like many of these aren't immediately ready to be used, and they would probably need to be brought back up to standard if they were to be implemented again as blast or fallout shelters. Now let's move to the east, and if we look at China, specifically Beijing, there's space underground for up to 7 million people, and we actually have got quite a good proof of concept or actual use of these shelters because 1 million people currently inhabit them as a form of cheap living space. And although I couldn't find too much information about Russia's shelters, I did find a study from 1982 that estimated that 70% of the population would have an available shelter. Again, it's hard to know what condition these shelters would actually be in, but it seems like there was extensive planning during the Cold War for sheltering the population. And an interesting side note is that there was reports recently that the Kremlin had ordered that these shelters be secretly assessed to see what condition they're in and what it would take to bring them back up to some sort of standard. But the purpose of today's video is to analyse the chances that an everyday citizen in the UK has of survival. And the sad truth about that is that the UK's answer to shelters is pretty much non-existent, at least for the general population. In fact, barring the example countries given, only a handful of countries have civilian bomb shelters or fallout shelters, which seems like a shame when you consider the exemplary efforts of the few countries that do. In the UK, the only way you'd have access to a government purpose-built shelter is if you were touring one of the dozen or so that have been converted into museums, or you were one of the chosen few that would be at the MOD's Defence Crisis Management Centre, Whitehall, from where a government would be able to operate. And even so, this bunker would be a massive target for any sort of nuclear power, so the survivability even in such a fortified shelter would be hard to predict. So what is the current government advice on a nuclear attack? What would they expect a UK citizen to do, and where should we go? On the official gov.uk website, all you can find is a page about the UK's nuclear deterrence, and although this is quite an interesting read, it provides no information or reference on what to do in the event of an incoming attack. There does exist a document, Nuclear Emergency Planning and Response Guidance, however this seems more aimed at a response to a nuclear meltdown at a power plant. Further Googling only seems to lead to US government websites which do offer some good advice for civilians, or even the site atomica.co.uk that archives the old Protect and Survive guidance produced in the mid-70s to the early 80s. This guidance may be old, but in terms of educating oneself on nuclear strikes, it remains quite useful for a preliminary learning. So, 1970s pamphlets and broadcasts aside, what else does our government offer us in the event of a nuclear strike? Barring deterrence, which we're assuming has already failed at this point, I can only see the following possibilities. An anti-air system? Does the UK possess any feasible system that could shoot down ballistic nuclear missiles? Not really. The UK does have Aster surface-to-air missile systems above the Royal Navy Type 45 destroyers. However, this would have to be strategically placed to even protect a few locations, and even then the system may find itself overwhelmed by the number of incoming attacks coming in at terminal velocity. For that reason, we can't confidently say that we could protect our cities against incoming ICBMs. Even the might of the US would not come out unscathed when trying to shoot down multiple ICBMs. It's also worth noting that the US ground-based ICBM interceptor costs over $75 million per unit and requires a missile silo to operate. Unless the MOD has something hidden up its sleeve, we can't count on a defence system against nuclear weapons. Number 2. Emergency alert system. As many other countries have implemented, we now have an emergency alert system in the UK, replacing the air raid systems that were phased out at the end of the Cold War. This would likely be used in the event of an incoming nuclear strike.
An emergency alert sends an urgent and distinctive siren-like sound to your mobile phone. It looks like this and sounds like this, appearing on your screen until you acknowledge it. If you receive an emergency alert, you should stop what you're doing, read the alert if it's safe to do so, and do what it says.
As you can see, not something you'd want to swipe away. It's worth noting that all use of phones for civilian communication would likely be restricted quite fast, keeping an open channel for governmental and military communications and warning systems. The BBC would have control of all broadcasting through its wartime broadcasting service, or whatever remained of it. Radio updates would likely come from here. Potential continuation of government. Little is known about the exact procedures that the government would follow in the event of a full-scale attack in modern times. Cold War tensions made it necessary to have a plan in place to give powers to regional commissioners initially holed up in military installations to act as a representative to the Prime Minister, parted up into different regions around the country. Whatever structure of authority might emerge, you would like to think they would have the correct skills and be competent enough to organise a response to help survivors. I believe humankind's ability to adapt and to help each other can never be underestimated. I think it's fair to say that relying on the state isn't a practical solution for anyone looking to have a higher chance of survival in the event of this full-scale attack. So what can we do? Being prepared and having some knowledge of what to expect and to do is one factor. Geography or location is another. To be able to gauge what you can do to prepare and during an attack, we need to understand the different stages of danger that happen in a very short period of time after the nuclear reaction has taken place. I've called this part of the video Stages of Danger, because there are different phases of nuclear explosion and they offer different dangers that you have to be prepared for in different ways. Bearing in mind the first of these effects happen almost instantaneously, so without prior knowledge of what's going on, you might not even be able to have any idea of what's happening. Let's take an example city with just a single target being the city centre. Leicester is a good clear example. This is a 1 megaton bomb being exploded over the city and not hitting the ground, an airburst attack. So in this horrific scenario, Leicester's been hit by a 1 megaton nuclear airburst explosion. The first thing to kill will be the direct radiation, and for a 1 megaton bomb, you're looking around 2.5 to 3 kilometers away from ground zero, and it would be an instant death to anybody, especially out in the open in this range. There really isn't much advice you can give if you would find yourself in this situation, and it's likely unneeded. It would all happen so fast. So it's kind of a sad thought, but you wouldn't really have much chance out in the open in this proximity to the explosion. Next up would be the fireball and flash burns. You can see the fireball here in yellow, and this will have a radius of about 1 kilometer at this payload. The intense light will blind you temporarily, even up to 21 kilometers away in the daytime and 85 kilometers at night if looked at directly. The extreme light will be so intense that it causes third-degree burns up to 17 kilometers away, setting people's clothes alight if they were out in the open without terrain or building cover. You'd have to be 40 kilometers away for the heat to be mostly bearable, providing it was only a 1 megaton bomb. Heaven forbid anything greater in size. So remember, being out in the open between 12 and 17 kilometers away could still mean there's a higher chance you'd have horrifying life-threatening burns straight away, before what's to come. First-degree burns will be suffered up to 24 kilometers away. And to put this in perspective, it's been estimated that burns caused some 50% of the deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Next up, if that wasn't already bad enough, comes the blast wave, shown here in the red outline. This accounts for half of the bomb's energy, and it will travel at the speed of sound, around 767 miles per hour or 1,234 kilometers an hour. Bearing in mind all this has happened in seconds depending on how far away you are. Within 2.2 kilometers, all buildings will be destroyed or gutted completely, leaving their outer structure standing only for the most fortified buildings. Between this and the initial radiation, it would be very difficult to survive within this range if not underground. Within 4.7 kilometers, fatalities will be widespread, both from the lungs not being able to cope with the overpressure, and from people, structures and objects being flung around like ragdolls. 5 kilometers away from ground zero, brick houses could still be destroyed. This would take less than 20 seconds to hit after the initial explosion. Even 16 kilometers away, windows could shatter, so avoid standing near the windows and take cover if you are aware of the blast. It would take approximately a minute for its blast effects to hit at that distance, so don't be fooled into looking out of the window when you see the flash. Hopefully the emergency warning system would have pinged your phone at least 4 minutes before all of this were to take place. So in my view, and from a 1 megaton blast, you'd want to be at least 16 kilometers away and indoors to have an increased chance of survival. So you may be asking, but what about fallout, the radioactive dust that falls after all of the dangers? Well, it's often speculated that airburst would be the chosen delivery method in an attack, just as it was in 1945, meaning fallout radiation would be negligible as fallout relies on dust being sucked up by the fireball when it touches the ground, that then becomes irradiated when it falls back down to earth. Obviously this wouldn't happen with an airburst as it would be detonated above the city and wouldn't directly hit the ground. I'd like to deal with fallout radiation properly in another video, but for now let's have a look at the most populated cities and how they would fare in the event of an attack. Maybe you see your city on this list, or maybe not, but I'll leave a link in the description to this map anyway so you can check for yourself. The map we'll be using has a list of targets plotted during the Cold War. It was released by the National Archive, but remains mostly relevant today. And although ICBMs exist with higher and lower payloads in the USA, China and Russia's arsenal, let's assume most targets will be hit with 1 megaton ICBM, the equivalent of 1.6 million sticks of dynamite exploded in airburst form. Starting with the city with the highest population, and our capital, London. You probably already know what your chances are here, pretty slim, especially in a surprise attack scenario due to the capital being the home to the bulk of governmental buildings, the highest population density, and our beloved royal family. You'd likely see a high yield bomb as well as many smaller ones, and anywhere close to central London, even in an improvised shelter such as the Underground, the sheer number of earth-shattering explosions, intense heat and destruction would render your chances of survival not looking good. There's a good chance that entrances and exits to the Underground will be blocked or caved in, making it even harder to escape if you did survive. Outside of the moderate blast zone you may have higher chances, but you never know exactly where the strikes will hit. Going back to our targets plotted on Nuke Map, we can have a closer look and see pretty much all along the Thames, including the Ministry of Defence, Westminster and Buckingham Palace, and many famous sites and tourist locations would be hit, and a lot of the densely populated areas of London would be included in this. They would be likely totally decimated, causing widespread fatalities. I'll put a key here to show the approximate survival chances in each of these different coloured rings. There exists little definitive data, thankfully, on the actual survival rates as a percentage, but we can make an educated guess. The buildings that would on one hand offer some protection from the sheer energy released would also pose a great risk to human life upon their collapse or total demolition. Anywhere in this grey circle could still yield collapsing buildings, and of course you're still at a huge risk of burns. Let's put the population density side by side here with the targets. Now to Birmingham, England's second city, another big target being the second most populated UK city, and just take a look at all the strikes here. Again, the green circle will hit first and be lethal radiation. The yellow fireball centre will be lethal too. Grey will be quite uncertain, a big chance of being lethal due to the burns and the destruction of buildings, and the orange outer really depends on where you find yourself. Indoors in the centre of a sturdy building and you may be okay. Again, here we have the population density. Finally, we'll look at Scotland. Edinburgh and Glasgow would be heavily hit due to the naval communication centres, a large population, and further naval bases being situated there. Due to multiple launches being fired at these cities, hundreds of thousands of people would be affected, with instant fatalities possibly hitting 200,000 and up to 500,000 wounded in some way between the two cities. So let's compare the population density to the strikes again. I'll leave the link to the preset plotted map in the description, or alternatively you can go to the base nuke map website where you can plot custom nuclear missile strikes with different yields to your location or anywhere in the world. To make use of this, take a look at the impacts. If your home, place of work or study, or even daily commute falls inside one of the green or dark red outline circles, meaning the initial radiation or heavy blast damage, fatalities would be more likely than not. Not a nice thing to speculate about, but likely to be 80% or higher, especially if out in the open. Now to the part you can control, having a plan to respond to different nuclear scenarios. However unlikely a nuclear war is, it's better to have a plan that you'll never have to use than to be without one if the worst were to happen. To those that say they'd rather not survive, never underestimate the will to survive when an emergency does strike. Regardless, I'm sure you'll find it quite interesting. You don't necessarily have to share your plans with anyone if you think you'll face ridicule. One thing to consider is evacuation. If you find yourself living directly in a danger zone, like in the initial radiation or heavy blast radius, your plan should be to evacuate, given you've had prior warning of a nuclear attack. Of course, if you've been given a 4-minute warning via the warning system mentioned previously, it's too late to evacuate and you'd be better off staying put in a building. But one would imagine that any nuclear war between major powers would be preceded by days of increased threats and hostilities. We can imagine there'd be open source or released intelligence showing the movement of nuclear arms of the hypothetical enemy. There would likely be reports of phone calls and meeting requests by the big powers to the would-be attacker, seeing the seriousness of the situation and employing all available diplomacy at their disposal as urgent attempts to avoid a nuclear exchange. The decision will always have to factor in your normal life as to when to evacuate. There exists a strong possibility that nothing happens, and you wouldn't want to lose your job and livelihood if nothing were to happen. You may be able to make an excuse such as sickness to protect your job, work remotely if possible from a laptop, or take annual leave at short notice if things get too close for comfort with the geopolitical nuclear sabre rattling. The truth is, we don't know for how long the UK would be in a state of emergency before a strike would actually take place. If you think back to the COVID pandemic, when we were told to stay at home in lockdown, no travelling apart from essential journeys, I can pretty much assume it would be the same as this in the state of emergency but on a much larger scale. And that would include military roadblocks on motorways, martial law, and many other things that in day-to-day life would seem pretty crazy. In the build-up to any nationwide emergency such as this, the government has a task on their hands of managing perceptions and avoiding anarchy basically at all costs. But I assume that they would be able to do this and ensure that the public followed what they were saying, which again, the government's mandate would likely be a lockdown on steroids compared to the COVID lockdown. But if you were to find that window of opportunity in which you could evacuate, first you'd have to create a list of things for a bug-out bag. A backpack preferably, containing enough provisions to get by in the short term. If you were travelling by car, you'd want to fill it with provisions. Some essentials would be a personal dosimeter for each member of the party to measure radiation taken and knowledge of maximum dose per day. More of a fallout radiation precaution, but an important one in any nuclear-related bug-out bag. You'd also want water purification tablets. These can be bought quite cheaply online, and although they're not going to make water contaminated with fallout safe to drink, they will allow you to take water from unconventional sources such as rivers and streams. Another essential to bring is duct tape, because it has so many uses, including, if necessary, sealing off clothes against fallout dust. The general idea being that a minimal amount of skin is exposed, and therefore less dust to gather, and also you wouldn't get dust down your socks and in your waistband, for example. Make sure you bring black waste bags or dustbin bags because, again, they can be used as protective clothing or they can be used to dispose of clothing that has been contaminated already. A battery-powered radio and torch with spare batteries. Multi-packs of bottled water. Compact and easy yet nutritional food that can be eaten without a heat source to cook, like canned goods or military ration packs. A can opener. A multi-use penknife. Spare clothes. Sleeping bags. A small entrenching tool, and a UK road map in case of GPS failure. Now this isn't an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's things that you know you would want to bring. You might have your own medications or things that would be essential for you, but it's good to do some research and get this planned out prior to any situation arising, of course. The destination of your evacuation is one that's up to you. it will come down to your financial situation too. If you want to go full proper, you could have some land or weekend property in an area less likely to be hit, a retreat to go to if things were going south, so to speak. Otherwise, you could try and rent an Airbnb somewhere secluded, providing you can time it right to book out a month or two to see how things play out. Finally, if camping is your thing, maybe somewhere in the southwest or northwest of Scotland would be a safe-ish bet. Just remember to stay away from population centres, anything with a military base nearby, or any sort of scanning stations such as Fylingdales. Pick a location now when planning. So what other options are there? Well, you could build a shelter, and although this rules a lot of us out, if you have the financial means, you could have a professional company to install a blast shelter, or you could buy an old shelter that is now disused. Custom built shelters come in various sizes, but done right can protect against blast and radiation. If you have a garden, you can build a trench shelter. They reach down around 1.5 metres, but definitely check it's legal and safe to be digging up your back garden first. It wouldn't offer much protection in the huge pressure a nuke would create if you're close to an explosion, but it would certainly protect from the following fallout in case of a ground-based attack. The Cold War era blueprints and guides probably still offer the best advice on building this. So what's the final option that I'm going to present in this video? That is to stay put. If you're further away from the likely ground zero sites and out of the worst areas, you might want to stay put. Your home will have the best supplies, especially if you've already started prepping by keeping a rotated supply of canned goods and bottled water. Even if fallout isn't a worry so much, like with an airburst nuclear attack, supply chains would still be decimated, so pre-stocked supplies would be necessary. If you haven't already done so, you may choose to do this now. Keep a supply of at least a month's worth of canned food and water that you can eat as part of your normal life, and when it's getting close to expiry, you can rotate it out for fresh batches. Just a side note, however, a lot of this stuff will last much longer than its expiry date. There are videos of guys like Steve MRE who have eaten ration packs from World War II. Certainly not recommended, but a can of stew being 6 months out of date would be the least of your worries. In apartment buildings, upon hearing news of an incoming strike, get to the basements or underground car parks, or an inside passage like a staircase on the ground floor. In a house, get to the centremost room on the ground floor or basement. Lay flat on the ground, away from windows, and close curtains. This will stop the light being as intense. If the bomb has been dropped on the ground instead of an airburst, and you were outside at the time, remove outer clothes before entering any building and put away somewhere or in a black bag. Even inside of a home, you could create a so-called fallout room, situated in cupboards under the stairs or just the centremost room, surrounded by sandbags or furniture. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, only some sturdy buildings close to the explosion survived, and even in those cases the buildings were gutted and an empty shell was left. Some are still standing today as tributes. If you were outside at the time of an alert, run to the nearest sturdy building with thick concrete walls if possible, a solid structure. The underground would be the best of course, or a cellar. Lay flat on the ground in the centremost room or basement that you can get to and cover your neck with your hands. If you do not have time, dive behind any sturdy structure such as a wall, and again lay flat on the ground. Cover visible skin with clothing wherever possible to minimise the chances of burns. Some final thoughts on general survivability. Providing a potential enemy will be using counterforce and airburst weapons, and not simply wanting to spitefully wipe out tens of millions of people. At least half of the population could survive the first 2 weeks. This can never be guaranteed, and some estimates from the Cold War had as many as 80% of the population being wiped out within 2 weeks. An adversary such as Russia does have the potential to cause complete annihilation, but that potential could not be realised in my opinion without some sort of prior warning signs, and would lead to a first strike by NATO under certain conditions. Further survival will be down to the response of not only the UK, but the rest of the world. Bearing in mind 45% of the UK's food is currently imported, supply chains could be broken down by things much less serious than nuclear war. I've tried to be as thorough as possible to make the information provided in this video as accurate as it can be, and I'll leave some of my sources in the description. If you believe personally that it's worth prepping for an incident such as described in the video, educate yourself as much as you can with all resources available. I'm hoping to cover more aspects of this in future videos, including ground burst attacks, counterforce and counter-value strikes, and fallout survival in greater detail. I'd also like to cover survivability after the initial attack, and what a post-nuclear war UK might look like. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch or listen to the first episode of The Universe in a Bottle. I'll be making more episodes on the nuclear/apocalyptic subject amongst other thought-provoking themes, and I'd love to have you along.